Hi, everyone, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction, a regular Zoom panel that brings on authors with new and upcoming historical fiction titles. I'm so excited that you could be here for this special panel. We have four really great authors for you today. My name is Colin Mustful. I'm the founder and editor of History Through Fiction. We are a small independent press that publishes historical novels. Um, just a few things before we get going. If you won't be able to turn on your mics or your cameras, but you can interact with the panel on the chat. So why don't you go ahead and just say hello, let us know where you're joining us from. We will have a Q&A towards the end of the session. So if you have questions for our panelists, just hang on to them for a little bit, and then I'll announce when we're going to the Q&A, and you can post those questions in the chat, and I will facilitate the Q&A there. We do have a landing page with all of our authors' novels. I'm going to post that in the chat throughout the event. I'm going to do that right now. I just have to change the settings here. So there's a link there to a landing page that has each of our panelists' novels, and that will, if you want to purchase one of the novels, it'll take you to bookshop.org because bookshop.org supports independent bookstores. It gives a portion of the sales back to the bookstores, and we like to support them. I want to thank everyone who registered for the event. I also want to thank those that made a small contribution. This is a free event, but those that do make contributions, that helps us pay for Zoom, help us pay for Eventbrite, and offset the costs of just having the panel. So I think that's everything. I want to get started here. I'm going to move myself off screen, so it'll just be our panelists. And let's start with Erica Roebuck. If you could introduce yourself and let us know about your new novel.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Erica Roebuck, and my latest historical novel features two real brilliant women on two sides of the law during the Prohibition era. When I was working on my women in intelligence novels, a few people told me about a cryptanalyst named Elizabeth Smith Friedman, and she just captivated my attention. So she is the protagonist, and the antagonist we'll probably talk about a little later. But fans of my novel Hemingway's Girl and Key West settings and women in intelligence will enjoy this catch me if you can kind of foray into the dark alleyways of Prohibition.
Thanks so much, Erica. Let's go to our other Erica, Erica Rummel. If you could say hello and let us know about your novel.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Colin, for having me. To introduce myself, I'm a professional historian and was on the academic treadmill for some 20 years. And you may know the saying for academics, publish or perish. And so for those 20 years, I published badly academic books to advance on the career ladder to full professorship. And once I had achieved that, well, eventually I took early retirement to do what I really wanted to do, namely write fiction. And so my novels, some of them are autofiction and contain autobiographical elements. Most of them are historical fiction, like this latest, What They Said About Louisa. That's my 10th novel, and it's set in the 16th century. Luisa Abrego, the woman in the title, was a freed slave who moved from Spain to Mexico and ended up in a mining town. So this is a bit Wild West, like the Californian gold rush, except it's the Mexican silver rush. And despite of those difficulties and dangers that she faces, all ends well. And that is a characteristic of my historical novels. I do like to tell a feel good story, and I don't like to leave my protagonists hanging. So, at least in my novel, Luisa Abrego lives happily ever after.
Yeah, like you said that, at least in my novel. We'll get to
Yeah.
look forward to learning more about that.
Yes.
Let's go next to Judith Lindberg, author of Akmarl. If you say hello and let us know about your novel.
Hello. So I'm excited to be here to talk about Akmaral. This novel is about a nomad woman warrior on the Central Asian steppes in the 5th century BC. So a long time ago. And in fact, Akmaral is descended from the Amazon warriors who fought in the Trojan War and battled heroes like Theseus, Heracles, and Achilles. She knows from earliest childhood that she's destined to be a warrior, as everyone in her people's group must. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, the Amazons could not marry until they had killed in battle. And even though this is generations later and there clearly are men around, or there wouldn't be any generations, this group of people still continues with this tradition. Akmaral becomes proficient at the spear and the sword and most importantly horseback archery, which gives women equal footing on the battlefield as men. In fact, she becomes so skilled that she draws the attention of a young hostile man of her tribe named Erzan, who envies her as much as he desires her. As she grapples with his unwanted attentions, another tribe attacks. This is a small renegade group of Scythians, and the Scythians hail from what is today the Ukraine and central Russia. Um, they attack and try to take their grasslands, which are vital to keeping themselves alive and their herds. So she and Erzan and the rest of their tribe have to band together to defeat them. And along the way, they capture 3 as captives and slaves. And among those slaves is Timur, the group's leader, whose steadfast resolve, even as he is brutalized and diminished, and his penetrating blue eyes draw her in and lead her toward her destiny. And that's what Akmaral is about.
A lot at play there. It sounds fascinating.
Thank you.
Finally, we have Brooke Lee Foster. Brooke, hi, if you could let us know about your novel.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So I'm a longtime journalist. I worked for about 20 years writing magazine and newspaper articles, but I always dreamed of writing a novel. And I finally did it in 2020. My first one came out. So today I'm here actually talking about my third novel, All the Summers in Between. All the Summers in Between is about 2 friends who meet at the age of 20 in 1967 in East Hampton, out on Eastern Long Island. One is a wealthy city girl who comes out for the weekends, and one is a local, more hardscrabble girl whose dad's a plumber, and she's taking care of her little sister because her mother has passed away. And they sort of, I see them as 2 brokenhearted women who, for different reasons in their lives, and they meet unexpectedly and they get close really, really fast. It's one of those friendships where you don't know where one begins and the other ends, at the age of 20. And as the summer goes on, toward the end of the summer, something terrible happens, and it becomes this secret that they're keeping, and they grow estranged for 10 years. And the book begins in 1977 when they unexpectedly reunite. One of them, the wealthy city girl, Margot, kind of literally sails back into the other's life. And they're forced to reckon with this terrible secret from the past. It's like we all have a friend, like the one that got away, and suddenly that person comes back into your life, and you're trying to figure out if you actually want them there, if they were actually a good friend. And they're just kind of figuring out where they fit as women in their own lives 10 years later. And yeah, and there's kind of a mystery element. I like to write, historical fiction that's set in beach towns, and we can talk about why later. But there's some darker kind of threads going through the book too. So it's not just a lighthearted novel. There's a happy ending, like Erica was saying, but there's some darkness that kind of lurks in these beach towns I write about. So.
Thank you, Brooke. One thing I'll say for this panel is I think it's the largest variety of history that we've had featured on the panel, so this is kind of exciting. Let's go back to Erica Roebuck. Your novel centers on the Prohibition Rum War, something I had never heard of. So what is the Rum War, and who is put in charge of putting an end to it?
Well, the government decided after a lot of women campaigned to make alcohol illegal, to purchase it, to move it, to distribute it, all of that. You were allowed to drink it, but how you got it was illegal. And there were some exceptions here and there, but by and large, Prohibition lasted about a decade. It was called the Noble Experiment, which many people came to say later just really didn't work out. It was also called the Mad Decade. And what happened, despite the best intentions of people, is everybody started to figure out a way around it. When it comes to booze, you can't really get in the way of people and their booze. So I've talked to so many people on the road, they're like, oh, my grandmother had a still in the basement. And that is including the priest at my church. He was telling me all about his grandma's still, which is just funny. And when my book starts, it's when a lot of these small-time operators are doing small-time operations to supplement family income. So you would have small groups taking a boat. If they live in the Florida Keys, they take it to the Bahamas, which was British owned, pick up some cargo, run it back. And then this is where the last 12 miles come in. That's the area outside of the United States the Coast Guard could patrol that belonged to the United States. And so your cargo became contraband in the last 12 miles. So you really had to hurry to shore to get it on there, and then you could sell it. And when we're at a transitional time when my book starts, where it's the smaller operators, but organized crime now sees how much money is to be made, and Capone and people are starting to pour into South Florida and different places to become a part of this. And so finding the real women in history was fascinating. And my protagonist and my antagonist are both real women from history, as is the assistant DA of Miami, as is more higher up government officials and cryptanalysts. And that was one of the great surprises of working on this, that during the 20s, there were so many women who were working outside of the home that also had families. So the book really does explore a lot of that dynamic, the domestic ideas. You have families, women who are making good choices for their kids, women who are making bad choices that they think will help their kids, and just watching all of that play out. But it was a time like no other in US history. It was fascinating.
Well, it sounds like a lot of fun learning about those real historical figures. It maybe helped you didn't have to make up as much or, things to fit the narrative.
Yeah, I don't really have a great imagination for fiction. I'm a good researcher, so I find the history and then I write about it. I don't understand any of you who are coming up with characters. That to me is absolutely baffling. I need everything given to me from history. And it's just, and usually for me, truth is so much stranger than fiction. So a lot of the craziest parts of the book, the weirder it is, the truer it is. You can count on that.
Let's go to Erica Rummel. You wrote a book about Louisa Abrego, a real historical figure. Tell us more about who she was and how did you discover her story and decide that this is a person you wanted to write about?
Well, Luisa Abrego was a woman of color. Sometimes she's called morena, brown, sometimes negra, black. And she married a white man and moved with him to Mexico, as I said, and there was caught in the nets of the Spanish Inquisition, or rather the Mexican branch office. And she was accused of bigamy. So she was put on trial. She was interrogated. Witnesses were called, and this is where we get information about her life. In the end, however, she is acquitted, and that's the last we hear of her, and she disappears from the historical records. So I made up the rest of her life. Now, as far as the trial records are concerned, they still exist and they are sitting in the National Archive of Mexico City. The Most people, when they hear Inquisition, they think that this is this infamous institution with an army of spies that ferreted out heretics, uh, put them to torture, burned them at the stake, and made this execution a public spectacle. Well, that's all correct, but I should emphasize that this is not a special characteristic of the Inquisition. That's how the legal system worked at that time. In fact, some people thought that the Inquisition was more lenient than the state, and more inclined to. If you said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I've done wrong, I won't do it again," they might let you off. How did I come across this? Well, I came across it for the first time on a website of San Augustine, the city in Florida, where the couple got married. And that website tells you that this was the first interracial marriage, the first documented interracial marriage in North America. The emphasis is documented because I'm sure there were earlier mixed marriages. As far as the trial records are concerned, well, it used to be extremely difficult to get at those manuscripts. You had to go to the archive in person, show your academic credentials to be admitted, and then the security was worse than at the airport. You were allowed to only you were allowed to go in with nothing, and inside they would hand you a pencil and 3 sheets of paper. And if the manuscript was brittle, gloves, cotton gloves, so you wouldn't contaminate the manuscript. Well, all of this has changed enormously, and it's very easy now. You just go online, you order an image of the manuscript, you download it to your computer, and you can study it in the privacy of your own home. But you still have to decipher the handwriting of the scribe, so that still might pose a problem, and certainly needs practice. So that's how one gets at these sources nowadays.
Wonderful. Well, I do want to hear a little bit more about Louisa's life and how you were able to kind of fictionalize it. But let's go next to Judith and talk about your main character, Akmarl, which I believe this is. Could it be called prehistory? Like, how were you able to figure out about this person and create a life around her?
Good question, because I was thinking, as everyone is saying, their characters are characters from history. My character, Akmaral, is actually a character from archaeology. There in this time period, in this particular culture, which we will call the Scythian culture, although it gets very complicated and I'm not going to get super nerdy about it. But in this time period, there was no written record of the Scythians. The only written history was from Herodotus and other Greek scholars who mentioned offhandedly the people that exist in my novel. So what really started me writing was, in fact, archaeology. I love archaeology. I think it's just a treasure trove, quite literally, sometimes, of possibilities for stories, because the first inspiration for this book came from a burial that was found in southern Siberia, um, and it's called the Siberian Ice Maiden. And she was found high in the mountains in the middle of Central Asia, basically where Mongolia and Kazakhstan and China and Siberia all meet. And she was buried in the permafrost and completely perfectly preserved with all of her grave goods, and her body was intact, and she was buried with a feast, and she had gold, and she had this crazy tall, 3 foot tall headdress, and 6 horses were buried in her honor. So if you think about horses like a Tesla, that's how valuable this kind of sacrifice was to this culture at the time. And I was fascinated with her for all of these artifacts that were buried with her, but also there was a tattoo on her shoulder. And in fact, it's the same image that is on the top of my novel, this deer shape. And the deer has been interpreted as an important spiritual symbol, which it is also in Akmaral's culture in my novel. And you'll see these little curly things that are not normally on the heads of a deer. They're griffin's heads. And I'm like, what does this symbol mean? And she had other tattoos and she had all of this crazy stuff. So I was fascinated with her right from the start. And as I started my research, I discovered that there were lots and lots of female warrior burials all across the steppes of Central Asia, from the Ukraine all the way to Mongolia, and just buried with arrowheads and spear tips and all the weapons of war, but also with feminine effects, and most interestingly, with a mirror. So, according to the archaeology, a bronze mirror in this time period was not something you checked your makeup with. It was a spiritual symbol. It was a symbol of a spiritual leader or a shaman. So I said, okay, women with these mirrors, these spiritual elements, these feminine elements, but also women who are warriors. And because of all of this evidence, it's proven fact that there were women warriors at this time period, which I really wanted to understand what it would be like to be a woman tasked with being in violent situations, which is not something I'm particularly comfortable with. I don't know how many people really are. And also who were tasked with leadership. This was not a time when women had to fight to have equal footing. They were expected to fight and die for their people, just like in the military in throughout history for men. So it was a really fascinating opportunity for me to interpret the artifacts, to create Akmaral, this young girl who doesn't question her role in society. She knows what she has to do, just like we send our kids to school. This was how she was raised. This was her responsibility, and how she faces that responsibility, and how both internal and external forces transform her from a dutiful, cooperative young girl to eventually someone who unites the peoples of the steppes.
That's amazing. I'm just curious if you have any of your own background in archaeology, or are you just relying on the research that you're able to read about?
I feel like I probably have done enough material work to get a few degrees in archaeology over these few books that I've written, but that is not my background. I was a dancer and an actor and started writing because I was desperately bored on my temp jobs back when I had to make a living in some other way. So, but I definitely feel like I've learned archaeology through my work.
Well, and perhaps background in acting, you have to take on different roles and personalities and fake it till you make it, I guess. But
Oh yeah, that's a huge part of my process. In fact, I play my characters sometimes in the real world in the woods when people can't see me because it's weird.
probably a good idea.
I also play a rum runner. I do drinking and boating
There you go.
regularly in warm locations. So it's something we have to do for the work sometimes, and I'm
Some,
willing to
I think yours is way more fun than mine.
do it.
Well, let's go to Brooke. Brooke, you have a wonderful relationship here, a friendship that challenge it becomes it challenges the friendship for various reasons. Can you talk about these two friends and how you were able to, we all have good friendships and relationships that challenge us, but to actually get it onto the page and make it feel real and authentic and compelling. Can you talk about how you did that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I also think it's just so interesting to listen to the other panelists talk about where their ideas come from and just how different everyone's process is. Because for me, I got the idea for this book when I was on vacation with my family in Maine. We were taking this little boat across the harbor that the hotel offered to go into town to have dinner. And I looked up and saw this Victorian up on this grassy hill with a young mom outside hanging laundry on a line and a little girl doing cartwheels at her feet. And it was such an old-fashioned imprint it just made in my mind. And at that same time, there was this teak sailboat that was really beautiful and shiny and new and kind of sailed right by. And it immediately just captivated me. And I saw these two women. I saw two friends, and I saw them in the later years. I didn't know what years that was going to be, but I knew they were older at this point. And it was that one was coming back into towns and surprising the other one. And it's just so interesting that it just started with an image, like Erica was saying, Roebuck was saying how much she relies on what she finds in history. But for me, it's so much more daydreamy. I just have that part of me that then goes back in as a reporter and pieces together, the history of the place and the time period that I'm setting it. But I think one thing that helped flesh out their friendship on the page was figuring out where in time they were going to be living. And, my last book, My second book was also set in the Hamptons in Southampton, but that was in 1957. And 1957 is such a foreign time for me. I have to do so much reporting just to know, down to like if they dial the phone, how many digits were in a phone number, because actually it was 5 in 1957 in the Hamptons. And it took me so long to get that information. But you know what? You guys know, it's like you're like digging for this information, because if you put 7, someone's going to, see it and be like, that is not right. But for that book, I did so much interviewing of people who had summered out there in that time, to figure out what people were talking about, where they were shopping, what beaches they were going to. You're hearing about all the artists out there at the time, and how different, the Hamptons get such a bad rap for being the land of excess, and they are. But, at one time in this bygone era, it was a much quieter time where you had Truman Capote writing there and Lee Krasner painting, after Jackson Pollock died. And so anyway, when I was working on that book, I had sort of pieced together this idea that, women in the 40s went out to work when men were at war, and they were kind of forced out, and some of them loved it and some of them didn't, right? But by the time we get to the 50s and the men all came home from war, women are pressured to go back into the home. And, it's when we see all these like hysterical Cosmo articles about, to make your husband happy, like rub his feet when he gets home and have a fire waiting. And these are real articles. That's why we laugh at them. And that idea of putting on a beautiful dress and doing your hair and putting on kitten heels and going grocery shopping, but feeling like you might be dying inside, as Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique shows us, carries on until the early 60s. And both of my books had been set in those time periods and had looked at women kind of figuring out how to find happiness within those time frames. But I really wanted these two friends to exist in the late 60s. And by the time we get to the late 60s, things are really changing for women. There's a lot more hope. You have Betty Friedan has formed the National Organization for Women. You have the Equal Rights Amendment, where they're actually talking about putting a gender discrimination clause into it. It doesn't happen until 1971, but they're talking about it. You have women marching. You have the music with all the protest ideas. And, you have so much change and hope on the horizon. And I love the idea of two friends meeting as they're kind of, riding this wave of optimism and thinking that their lives would be so much different than their mothers. And then the 70s coming in and falling like a big fat hangover. What actually happens to a lot of these women in the late 60s, lots of people in my family included, when I look back and kind of think about their lives, is that they began in their 20s with all this hope and then found themselves in their 30s, back in the same position as their mothers. If they're working, they're making 62 cents on the dollar. They're just, the things didn't quite work out the way they planned. And so the two friends in 1977, when they reunite, they're sort of forced to re-examine a lot of those dreams they had when they were 20, and say to themselves, how far have we actually really come? And I think the two friends, I think for a lot of us, when friends come back into our lives, they're reminders of who we were back in the past and things we wanted and dreams we had. And when they get together, there's this sense that, who are you now? What happened to you? And then there's a little bit of embarrassment, like, I don't know what happened to me, And so I think that getting that aspect of their friendship onto the page and making them really come alive with their hopes and dreams and regrets and sorrows, is what really made the friendship real. But I think too, friendships aren't easy. It's really hard to keep up with friends. There's no real architectural blueprint for how to have a great friendship. Often those friendships kind of fall behind your marriage and taking care of your kids, and how do you put in the time to stay close? And I think unless you have two people really committed to doing that, it can be really challenging. And so the whole time that this book is unfolding, even in the earlier timeline, they're always trying to figure out, how important are we really to each other? And there are times when it ebbs and flows, which also I think is really natural in human relationships. So
Brooke, that was just a remarkable response. You brought up so many good issues there, and not just about your craft, but about some of the issues that are brought up in all of these novels. So um, I really think that is goes to show the valuable work that all of you are doing in bringing these stories to life. So thank you for that. And I'm really enjoying the conversation. It's fun to kind of see you all together. Although, like I said earlier, the histories are different, but we can see that the craft is the same. The end goal here is the same. I'm going to post the link one more time to where readers can find your novels. And I've got a few more questions here. I'm going to remind the audience that we will take a Q&A, so start thinking of some of those questions you might have for our panelists. We'll do that in a little bit. Let's go back to Erica Roebuck. So we have some differences here in that someone like Judith or Erica had to kind of fictionalize parts of their character's life, even though they were historical figures. You talked about having a lot of research available, a lot of documentation available, but certainly you had to create a narrative around these two women. So Elizabeth and Marie, can you talk about how you were able to take that research and then make it into a narrative and where you had to kind of fill in the gaps?
Sure. I do start with, if I can go to places or to archives, read any biography or biographical material that I can. The Friedmans were a big, huge part of NSA. William Friedman basically was part of the Black Chamber, which preceded the National Security Agency. So there's a cryptology museum there that I was able to visit. The National Archives in DC have all the Coast Guard files from the dawn of time, pretty much since Hamilton founded the Treasury and all of it, and then moved from there. And then I was able to also consult with the George Marshall Foundation at the Virginia Military Institute, who has the Friedman family papers. And so all of these gave me a ton of information. But for the flavor of the time, and for both women, they both worked in areas where they didn't leave much of a paper trail in terms of their jobs. They weren't able to. Elizabeth's work was classified, and only recently, most of it has been declassified. And then Marie, as a rum runner, you had to get what you could out of the newspaper. She changed her name. She had many different identities, many different husbands. So actually, for that one, the most valuable tool was newspapers.com, because I could go to the South Florida papers in the 1920s and in real time read about what was happening to her and her circles, which was just absolutely invaluable. And then you throw in the ads that you see around it, and you really, and the flavor of the language of the time. So all of that was really helpful. But again, because they both were in work that wasn't leaving a very specific paper trail, I had to do some jumps with fiction. And that's where the author's note comes in. So if I don't understand, or if they don't document how Elizabeth may have traveled from this place to this place, I'm able to fill in the gaps through fiction there, because specific conversations weren't archived. I know these women, so I figure I know what they would say, but I can't necessarily prove that they would have said that. And then sometimes, just for ease of story, and because it is a novel, it's not a biography, I combine characters. So for some of my Coast Guardsmen, I make a composite character so that we don't have new crews on new boats every single time we're with them. And again, I note all of those in the author's note. So where I do take those liberties with history, I try to disclose it. But for the most part, I can find a pretty good trail of breadcrumbs through the past.
Do you find in the editing phase that maybe you recognize or your editor recognizes, hey, these three people could easily be one? How does that work?
Usually I'm able to figure that out when I'm doing my edits before I turn it into my editor, because I start to see the arc of the characters in the story, and which people are really, really necessary and who are not. So I'm usually the one that's able to see that. Occasionally my editor will be able to have me consolidate. But usually it's more about scenes with my editor, about what serves the story, what doesn't. Kill your darlings, elaborate here, take away there.
Well, let's go back to Erica Rummel. I'm curious to know about, I read that Louisa, there's certain things that have been written about Louisa, but they're always from a very specific point of view that might not actually tell the whole story of who Louisa was. So can you talk about how you were able to first read what's been written about her, and then how you were able to determine who she actually was for this story?
Yes, we have all been talking about doing research, and but perhaps as a professional historian, I have an advantage, but it's not really. I feel that even after having done all that research, I still uh, don't know who Louisa was. I don't believe in the historical truth with a capital T. I think we just do subjective interpretations. And that is why in my book, each chapter is told by a different character. And at the end of the book, we still don't know what Louisa is like, but we have 10 different takes. We have 10 different views by white people who may have come in contact with her and who give us the prejudices that would have been current, and the hierarchies that would have been current in the 16th century. So in that manner, I'm able to give different points of view. And there is, of course, always the difficult question, can, as one of my characters puts it, can a white man understand a black woman? And I think we understand each other by filtering what we say to each other through our own experiences. And so the more radically different our experiences are, the more difficult it is to understand the other person. So also going back to the Spanish Inquisition, there is of course also the difference between the New World and the Old World. And I noticed, for example, that the Mexican Inquisition has two or three times more bigamy cases than the Spanish Inquisition. And I think that's because men tended to emigrate by themselves and leave their families behind, thinking perhaps that they were going to return quickly. And then that didn't happen, and they were stuck in Mexico and eventually ended up marrying local women. And some of them got denounced to the Inquisition, others got away, or as in the case of my Luisa Abrego, actually accused themselves, denounced themselves to the Inquisition because they had scruples, because they wanted to clear their conscience. So this is, we don't know, of course, if she was aware when it came to the trial. It turned out that somebody else had already denounced her. We don't know, was she aware of that, and was this a strategic move that she accused herself and thought perhaps that it would be better for her to come forward.
I'm curious, do you, in learning so much about her and then finally sharing her story, do you get a sense of grief or pity for what she went through, or do you feel more hope in being able to champion what she went through so that others can learn from it?
Well, in the fictionalizing, of course, I make her uh, have the same feelings that I expect we would have in such a case. And so it gives me an opportunity to show what a woman with her, from her background, would go through when she, for example, ends up in Zacatecas, which is pioneering country and still has uh, suffers from indigenous raids. Or how would she have felt in Mexico City? Is that in any way comparable to her experience in Seville, where she comes from? And I think it perhaps was, because those were cities of roughly the same population, about 150,000, and both cities had a very large Black population, both free and enslaved. So Louisa would not have stuck out as a woman of color there.
Interesting. Let's go back to Judith. Judith, we talked about this a little already, but I'm just really curious about how you're able to take archaeological information and make it into a historical narrative, historical fiction narrative. What are maybe some of the similarities and differences between doing research in documented research versus what you had to do for this novel?
It is interesting because the pleasure and the challenge of working with the archaeology is that we only have the things that have survived and that have been discovered. And so when I look at the archaeological material, I don't know who actually the Siberian Ice Maiden really was, but I know what they left to her and what belonged to her and what we found. And I look at the materials and I say, well, what is the meaning of these objects? Were they personal objects that were precious to her? Were they symbols of her position and her importance to her people? And it's not just Akmarel, but all of my characters essentially sort of piece together as I discover artifacts. So I might find a fascinating, beautifully decorated dagger, which is amongst the artifacts, and I say, well, where did this come from and who made it? And I decided that her father was a skilled blacksmith. And I find there's so much gorgeous gold in the Scythian record, and that like the artifacts are absolutely beautiful. And they're intricate, and they're always of these twisting, straining animals, sort of like the flying deer on the cover of the book. And I decided that somebody had to know how to work with gold. So a character evolved from that. Obviously, we have the warriors, and there's there are male warriors and female warriors, and at various ages. And one particular burial had a young woman, probably 16 or 17, and she was clearly killed in battle, and she had battle wounds on her skeleton. And I'm like, well, who is that? And how did she die? And an entire narrative and part of the primary part of the opening of the novel has to deal with that particular skeleton. I don't call it a skeleton in the book because that's gross, but I breathed life into this particular burial and decided how, based on the information I have through the understanding of the culture and the people, I create a life for her. The other thing that I do, along with the archaeology, because, everything is dead in what I'm digging up, I have to find living, breathing examples of how they live their everyday life. So I'm very lucky that there are still people in Central Asia that live some semblance of the same nomadic life that my characters live. They still not a lot of them, but they still are. There are still herders who go with their sheep and horses and camels up into the highlands in the summer, and they come back down to the steppes in the winter, and they still live in yurts. And we're not talking about glamping, fancy yurts. They're very beautiful but utilitarian um, tent houses that they carry, and so I studied that sort of lifestyle across multiple cultures, Kazakhstan and Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan. They're all a little different in the modern day, and I conflate and I separate out commonalities, and then I compare them to, for example, there are petroglyphs, stone sketches in all through this region from prehistoric, even much older than my character's culture, that show people living the same way and hunting and battling and having shamanic rituals, which are still practiced in the modern day. And I kind of weave the past and the present and evidence that seems connected both to the ancient past, but also very much vital today. And that's how I create the day to day life of my characters, their belief systems, which are deeply rooted in shamanism, which is an ancient ritual practice, and animism, which is the worship of animals and nature itself. And that's how I sort of use all of the resources that are available to me to bring the archaeology, but also the life to the page.
Well, it's amazing how much goes into that. I'm curious, does any geological evidence go into what you're doing?
Geological is interesting. There is an element of climate change that does affect the plot at a certain point, and there is evidence that climate change did push migrations and conflict within not just this particular period, but pretty much all of human history is about resources. And when resources are scarce because of some sort of natural issue, disaster, or whatever, that's when we start seeming to fight each other. So I definitely say geology is a part of it. It's not a primary part of it, but the climate absolutely is.
That's just fascinating, just how much you have to pull together to put the narrative together.
Mm.
Well, I want to ask Brooke about the music in her novel. Before I do, I want to invite our audience to start posting their questions in the chat, and I will sort through those and ask our panelists. So, Brooke, the music is a central theme in your novel. Tell us why. Was it just always kind of there? Why did you decide to incorporate music, and how is it important to the story?
I love that question. Okay, so there's about 35 songs referenced. It may be a few more in this novel. It came in part because when I first, I'm not gonna lie, when I first was messing around with these two girls, I wanted them at a Beatles concert at Shea Stadium in 1960, I think it was 63 or 62. I wanted them there and I wanted to write a scene at Shea. And then that just didn't work out. But as I was going through and figuring out that no, this is going to be exactly 1967 in the early part and 77 in the later part, I started just thinking so much about the music, the role that music played in everyone's lives back then, you know, with Dylan kind of starting with some of the folk music and protest songs, and Simon and Garfunkel and kind of leading into, you know, Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane, kind of her go-to line to audiences back then is like, we're the people that your parents warned you about. It's like, stay away from us, you know? And this idea that kids could be, at that time, we're going to just be so different. I loved playing with that. So I tried to use music to divide, but also to unite, you know, the young people in the novel. At one point in the book, someone says something like, oh, Margot, one of my characters says something like, well, you know, you're not supposed to trust anyone over the age of 30. You know, there was really such a mentality of us versus them back then, which I thought was really great fun. I also have the women working in a record store in East Hampton in 1967. There was no record store in the Hamptons back then, believe it or not. They used to buy their albums at the pharmacy. But I wanted to have a woman-dominated record store and have them talking about women artists and, you know, the rise of kind of the women rocker. So that goes on. And then I play with music in the book. You know, there's this part where the main character, the local hardscrabble girl, she meets this boy named Felix, and he in the record store, and they bond a little bit over music. And when he asks her out for the first time, he calls the record store on the, you know, on the phone, and she asks for her, and she goes over to him and, you know, says hello, whatnot, and he says, go to, you know, this magic moment and flip it over to the B side. And she's like rifling through the records, and when she takes it out, you know, she pulls out the album, and inside is a little note from him. So I just tried to play with music and records and, you know, and whatnot. But it's also, you know, my parents met out there. My dad's band allegedly played at one of Andy Warhol's epic parties out there. And they met in Montauk in the early 70s. And, you know, music has always been a part of my life as well. And so when I was writing this novel, whenever I was working on some of the emotional scenes, and actually this is true for all my novels, and I'm so curious if you ladies do the same thing, but I always have one or two songs that I really write emotions to for each book, and they vary for each one. And for this book, it was Elton John's Yellow Brick Road. And there's just every emotional scene between these two friends. That song was playing on repeat. And what I do is I sort of reread whatever I've been working on as far as the emotional dialogue goes. And as it gets to kind of the crescendo, that's when you sort of like either feel it or you don't. And so I use that a lot in the book too.
I totally use music in my
Yeah.
book. And particularly because, like, you'd think there's no music from that time, which there technically isn't, but there's this particular style of music from the region that I would listen to. And there was this one song that's seriously like a heavy duty droning, just, you know, you feel really weighted when you listen to it. And I played it every time I had to write a battle scene because I had to, like, okay, I have to go to battle. And I would like get myself ready to go because I didn't want to go any more than she did.
It's true. And there's just magical moments in all of our lives that we have set to soundtracks, right? And so there's this like really awesome moment, at least in my mind, when, you know, as writers, we love certain moments in our book. And there's this moment where she and Felix, this is not even a love story, this novel, but there's just a couple of sweet moments between these two. And they're in this pizza shop in Amagansett that still is there today. And a Bob Dylan song comes on, and they both just, you know, they're feeling the moment so strongly. And that power of music, I really wanted to try to have that come through the page, the way it sort of can make us so joyous or support us when we're feeling down, and even help flesh out our identity, you know. And these women in 1967 and 1977 have very different identities, and they look at music in completely different ways, and different songs for how their mood, you know, however they're feeling at that time.
Yeah, it would definitely create a lot more depth to the character. Excuse me. We have a bunch of questions. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I see the first couple asked about taking liberties with the historical fact. As Greg calls it, a stubborn fact creates problems for the storyline. How do you choose between facts and the narrative? Anybody can hop on that one.
Well, I would definitely favor the narrative. And I think one has to make that clear to the reader sometimes. Some readers don't understand that this isn't a history book, this is a novel. And so I feel I'm absolutely entitled to make of the character what I want them to be, and even be a little free with the dates, and have people meet that in real life couldn't possibly have met. I think this is creative freedom that we can indulge in, and readers should be aware of the fact that we give them a lot of history, a lot of details. So it's a fun way of learning about history, but don't put it in your essay when you have to write an essay.
I also think when we do our historical notes at the end, I know I make notes of when I change things and make sure that I make a note of that in the historical notes, because I recognize, you know, I have such respect for the scholars who've enabled me to know the information I do. I'm not out there digging up the bones. And I want to acknowledge when I alter facts by, you know, saying the reference point where I went a different way and giving opportunities for those who do want to know where to look for the real information.
Yeah, and I think you can be within reason, you know. The When I was recounting a scene between Andy Warhol does show up in this book for a very short amount of time. And when I was writing that dialogue, you know, I had to be careful to, you know, watch YouTube videos of him speaking and know generally what he would have been thinking about at that time, where he was in time, and make sure that whatever came out of his mouth wouldn't be so factually off. You know, there's ways that you can get pretty darn close without knowing exactly what they said, but kind of guessing in an intellectually informed way what they would have said. So as long as it's within keeping of the historical period and that person, I think you creative liberties are just fine.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also include a selected bibliography at the end with nonfiction for further reading, because I know a lot of people, once they do have the emotional connection to the characters, they want to know the nuts and bolts of history. So for those who do, I can send them on a deep dive the way I've gone to.
Yep. I do that on my website. And there's so much material out there. And
Yeah.
Erica Rummel is correct that it's so much easier now to do the kind of research that we do. I remember the days when you had to go to the library and get interlibrary loan.
Right.
Well, there are several questions about characters and getting to know your characters. One that struck me is by Sharon, who asks Erica, who was more fun to write, Elizabeth or Cleo? And were you rooting for one of your characters over another?
That's very interesting. So Cleo Lithgow was the first woman rum runner of notoriety who actually passes the torch to Marie Waite in the book. And Marie Waite is my antagonist. Elizabeth Friedman is the protagonist. I thought I knew who I would be rooting for the whole time, and I'm a rule follower, so I thought it would be the cryptanalyst. And lo and behold, as the arcs start to crisscross, I started find myself very captivated by Marie and her bad decision making, because I felt like I understood where she came from and why she was doing what she was doing. And I started rooting for her a little bit. She made terrible decisions. I don't endorse any of them, but I did take great pleasure in writing some of those things. Also, Elizabeth had a very sweet and tender marriage, and Marie did not. And there was just a real charge out of absolutely thinking, what is the worst thing to say or do in any situation? And having a character do it, it's very engaging when you're writing. So it's a toss up, but I think the antagonist might have stolen the show.
I wonder what that reveals about you.
I know, right? Oh, I have a dark side. Believe me, Colin. I
Do you,
wanted a break from World War II, so I went into crime and murder, and I was like, oh,
oh,
this is
geez.
fun. Yeah.
We have a very specific question from Elizabeth for Judith. She says on page 322, Judith says that ultimately it's a story of matriarchy versus patriarchy. And then she asks, you talk about stirrups making the difference. What does that mean?
Oh, so yeah, I was actually not sure you'd get to that question, so I was going to write to Elizabeth directly. But stirrups were invented somewhere around the 200 AD, and this is 500 BC. And I think your question had said something about were women not allowed to use stirrups. They didn't exist at all. And when I do like a slide presentation, I have images of burials where you can see that the bones of their legs were bent from holding on with all their might, riding horses. So they didn't have stirrups at all. It's kind of an amazing thing. Um, as far as matriarchy versus patriarchy, a big part of the novel centers around when Timur, the renegade Scythian, comes along and introduces both to Akmarel and her people the idea that women weren't equal. And he's only one man, and he doesn't get to change the rules entirely. But he has it's a remarkable moment where Akmarel has to really consider where he's coming from, and she's so confused by his attitude. And as they later confront the larger world, this becomes a driving force of and a question of what does it mean to be a leader for a woman? What does it mean to be a leader at all? And in the archaeological record, could get nerdy, but won't. They actually, there's clear evidence of a shift in belief system that has to do with the direction that the burials were laid to rest, whether it's east, west, or north, south, or facing which direction. And so, I mean, it's a much more academic discussion than the novel deserves, but the real question of how did these women have the standing they did in the time they did and what happened to it is very much a part of what I want to try to lean into as the novel evolves. I'm not going to tell the end of the book, and you can make your own decisions, but it is a really interesting question to me about matriarchy and patriarchy and whether the world would be a better place if women ran it. Well, we could have a conversation about whether it would or not, and how the forces of and competition between male and female perspectives affect the way individually or as a society we exist.
Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I could definitely listen to all of you talk about your novels for another couple hours, but I know everyone has other things to do. I want to thank our panelists so much for being here. I want to thank all of everyone who attended this panel. There will be a recording. It will be available on YouTube. I'll send it out in an email as well shortly after we finish. Before we do finish, I always end by asking one last question, and that is, why historical fiction? All of you have done a ton of research. I'm sure you could probably write a nonfiction book. But what is the value of making the history into a fictional narrative? Brooke, if you could start us off.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was just, I love going back into the past and seeing what life was like. I think so many times we have people in our lives who tell us, oh, it was so much better back then, right? Or things were so different. And for me, I just love investigating. It's the reporter in me. How different actually was it? Were things really that much better? Because for women, oftentimes the answer is no, it wasn't really all that much better, and one piece of information I found so crazy when I was researching was just how years later, when they look back at when researchers look back at Woodstock and the idea of free love, um, that actually was a terrible time for women because so many women were sexually assaulted at Woodstock. And, this idea that everybody was so happy at that music festival is actually just not true. So I think going into history with a new lens and a new perspective and asking questions and then, putting it all together in a really ultra readable story is really, really important and really, really fascinating. It's just something I love to do.
Thanks, Brooke. Erica Roebuck, what do you think?
I just remember reading Beloved by Toni Morrison and having such a deep emotional connection to the characters. It had been history I'd read about a dozen times in a textbook, but reading the fiction, getting to know the family, going into their home, it made me so invested. And that's, I think, the beauty of historical fiction is you do get to know the people inside of the history, and that it makes you more empathetic. So.
Definitely. Erica Rummel, what's the value of historical fiction for you?
Uh, I think for me, it is partly frustration with the limitations of the sources. You get some very interesting, some fascinating glimpses, and then, as in the case of Louisa, you lose the trace of that person again. So there is a great temptation to say, well, what happened afterwards, or how did she develop? And you have that as a historian, you don't have that freedom, but as a novelist, you do. So that's part of it. And also that the questions that confront us today very often are already there 200, 300, 500 years ago. And I think it's interesting to put them into perspective and to show that this isn't something that just our generation confronts, but that other generations had to struggle with the same questions.
Yeah, great point. Finally, Judith.
So I clearly like to dig really far in the past, and I always think people wonder what that has to do with our modern experiences. And as much as I feel that historical fiction, especially ancient historical fiction, opens our eyes to another time, another place, another belief system, another lifestyle entirely, it also goes to the root of our humanity because we were still human beings, Homo sapiens, the same kind of biological entity 2,500 years ago that we are today. We were 10,000 years ago. We were still capable of all the reasoning and all the learning and all the pain and love and hope and dreams. And I feel that by breathing life into the ancient past, we recognize the eternal quality of our humanity. And I hope that by setting it in a very different time, we see that eternal truth of our human heart.
Well put. Thank you, Judith. Well, thanks again, everyone, to our panelists, to our attendees. This has been great, and I've had so much fun, and I look forward to picking up your novels and learning more about these histories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for
Thank
having
you.
us.
All right.
Yeah.
Have a good rest of the day.